We're all complicated, right? But how about a man whose strongest political belief was religious freedom, yet who is remembered as a religious bigot who massacred sectarian enemies? Someone who built a democracy with a written constitution, but also led a military regime. Imagine a man labeled both a democrat and a dictator, a zealot and a progressive, a regent and a regicide, a hero and a war criminal. All men are complex, all are multifaceted, but few are as complicated, nor were their complications as significant for the fate of a nation as history's most complicated man. Hello, and welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most Complicated Man. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and we are delighted to be joined today by Martyn Bennett, professor at Nottingham Trent University and the author of numerous books on the English or British civil wars, not least Cromwell at War, which was kind of one of the inspirations for our recent episode on Oliver Cromwell. And we felt that although we talked about his military career in some depth, we didn't really do justice to Cromwell the man, who, as the episode's title suggests, we think is really one of the most kind of complicated people to kind of study and get your head around. So that's why we invited Martyn on the show to come and talk with us about Cromwell the man. So thank you very much for joining us, Martyn.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Brilliant. Well, let me kind of set the scene, if you like, of why Cromwell is a complicated character to understand. I think, speaking from personal perspective, as a school child in the British education system, early on we kind of learnt what might be termed the Whiggish view of the English Civil War, and Oliver Cromwell within it, as a kind of stepping stone on the road to democracy. Growing up a bit more and becoming more of a kind of historian, if you like, by studying history in university and things like that, it came across more complex interpretations of Cromwell, and also more negative ones. The Churchillian interpretation of him as a military dictator, a ruthless tyrant. And then, of course, there's Cromwell's actions in Ireland, which we did touch on before, but in terms of his perspective on the other side of the Irish Sea, he's seen as quite plainly a war criminal, someone guilty of almost ethnic cleansing. So today's episode, we're going to try and get to the root of Oliver Cromwell, who he was, what he believed, how he should be remembered, and maybe we've set ourselves a bit of a impossible challenge. I know a lot of people who studied Cromwell, I think it's fair to say yourself included, Martyn, who still think that there's a lot of kind of things about him that really are almost contradictory, or it's hard for us to get our head around or properly understand. So we're going to start with something that I think is going to be the easiest or least complicated aspect, which is going to be a brief look at Cromwell's military career. We talked through in our previous episode on Oliver Cromwell the battles he fought in, things like this, and why he was so successful. In your opinion, Martyn, what were Oliver Cromwell's greatest kind of military achievements?
Well, I think we have to start to look at that through the way he develops from being a man with absolutely no military experience whatsoever, and develops into a leader of large numbers of troops in a very short space of time. it goes against most of what was written in the contemporary military manuals about how long somebody should work their way up through the ranks and how they should spend a lot of time learning the mechanics of whatever arm of the armed forces they were in, whether it was artillery, infantry, or cavalry. And yet I have this man who hasn't even done the things that people of his social standing might be expected to do in terms of military training, such as either serving on the continent during the ongoing wars over there, or even just playing a role in the local militia, the trained bands. As far as we know, he hasn't any connection with the trained bands whatsoever. He's also then appointed a captain, which is something that is decried in military manuals, that captains are important figures. They're crucial in the leadership of a regiment of infantry, cavalry, whatever. And they're often, in certain armies, political appointments, people appointed because of their politics or because of their family status and standard. And that is denigrated because it can lead to really good professional officers being thrust out of place. Yet Cromwell manages to train himself or be trained by others. We're still very vague on that. I have this image of him riding on his horse, leading his troops in some form of training activity in the Fenlands, and with a military manual or two on the pommel of his saddle, reading it as he goes along. Because some of the things that he does early in his military career are textbook. You can almost read the passage that he took in order to compile a military report. So he becomes a captain of horse, which means he's in command of 60 to 80 men at the very beginning of the Civil War. And he doesn't see much action. He interrupts a convoy leaving Cambridge with silver plate from the colleges to go to the King's cause. But he's in the company of other men who are equally responsible. He misses the Battle of Edge Hill. We're not entirely sure how, but it seems that his regiment, or his part of the regiment, was out on a scouting mission elsewhere. So he doesn't see the main action of the main military action in 1642. But by 1643, the very beginning of that year, he's become a colonel, which means he doesn't command 60 to 80 men. He now commands up to 6 troops of horse, each of which has 60 to 80 men. Over the next few months, he accumulates it becomes a double-sized regiment. So he's almost, in effect, what we would now call a brigadier general. He's got a double regiment, and we know it's a large regiment rather than some of the other regiments are small, composed of far smaller numbers than they should be. So within a few months, he's rocketed through regimental command and field officer command to command a regiment. Within a year of that, he's a general. So he goes from 60 men at the beginning of the war in August 1642 to up to 6,000 men under his command within 18 to 20 months of that. That's a pretty astounding record. So he's obviously a very quick learner, even though he's, by what you would estimate in that period, a middle-aged man. He's 42 when he starts soldiering. So pretty late in his career, he manages to learn very quickly. Now, beyond that, we know he's got that intense personal relationship with his soldiers that good commanders have. He's interested in their livelihoods. And this will come back when we talk about his religion. But he's interested in being fed and clothed, looked after and trained and well led and respected by the other officers. He's got that. What he also has, which I think is one of his unique facets, is that he's got a brilliant eye for landscape. We don't know why. It's suggested this is because he's a man who likes to hunt regularly and therefore rides over countryside that would be suitable for cavalry actions. But we don't really know. That's very much a guess. But we do know that he has it. And that he, for instance, in the Battle of Marston Moor, which I understand you've already talked about, in a way you could argue he wins that battle 2.5 hours or so before it begins. He certainly is able to understand the battlefield at Naseby far more quickly than anybody else. And it's that understanding that leads to that victory. He's also able to use terrain that isn't good. The Battle of Dunbar, the Battle of Preston, both of those are areas where he's not actually in a very good, brilliant position to start with, yet is able to take advantage of it. And then, of course, you add to that the final level, the ability to lead a campaign and administer large numbers of troops, in fact, multiple armies. You've got the Worcester Campaign, which is, I would argue, in terms of world military history, it is, in miniature, it's Napoleon's brilliant Ulm campaign in 1805, brought into Britain by Cromwell, where he manoeuvres the royalists into a position from which they can't escape, and he masses 2 to 3 times their numbers at Worcester, seemingly without sweating. It is consummate. And all of those things are brought together in that ability to see the ground, that ability to organize, the ability to make sure his men are well looked after. Add those together, and you get one of the most brilliant generals that Britain has ever produced, possibly the most brilliant cavalry general, because within 150 years, nobody thought very much of cavalry leadership in British military history. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. You've even kind of preempted my next question, which was really going to be, should Oliver Cromwell be considered in the pantheon, if you like, of great British generals or military leaders, like, say, a Nelson, a Wellington, a Montgomery? But I'm guessing from what you say, you really think he should be held in that high an esteem.
Yes, he should. His battlefield victories are unquestioned. There's not one of the victories in which he's a commander is anything that you could think of as other than emphatic. And what marks him out in British history is he is like, Nelson's an absolutely brilliant naval commander, but winning the Battle of Trafalgar doesn't win the Napoleonic Wars. Wellington at Waterloo, regardless of the Prussian involvement in that, actually does win a war and bring to end a series of wars. Cromwell does that within Britain. Of all the good generals he's against, and there are many good generals during the Civil War period that he's up against, he is the only one who emphatically ends the war.
Well, if that isn't a case that Cromwell is history's most underrated general, then I don't know what is. Let's then move to another aspect of his career, which is related, which is Cromwell's time in Ireland. I know this is an area that you are kind of looking at and have got a collection of essays coming out next year, I believe. What exactly does Cromwell do in Ireland that is questionable, and how questionable is it in the context? When we talked about the sieges in Ireland, Wexford, Drogheda, I kind of said this was kind of what happened. Giving no quarter was fairly standard practice. I'm not 100% convinced I was correct. What's your interpretation?
If we're talking about Drogheda particularly, it is not exceptional, but it is rare that an order to give no quarter is given. In the rules of warfare, if a garrison had defied a summons to surrender and its position was hopeless, then it could expect the aftermath of the siege to be bloody and frightening. The problem is that at Drogheda, the position wasn't actually hopeless when the royalist commander there refused Cromwell's summons. We've got to think of two things, I think, with Ireland, maybe more than two, but we'll deal with two. The context you brought up, the context is important, but there is no getting away from the fact that Drogheda was an absolutely awful and atrocious event. It doesn't matter necessarily how many people were killed in Drogheda. That's not necessarily what I think makes it a terrible event. What makes it bad is that that was deliberate. Cromwell not only did instruct that they should give no quarter, they shouldn't accept the surrender of soldiers, they shouldn't necessarily be careful in what they're doing in the aftermath of the break-in to the town. It's that he exulted in it. He saw it as something that he should do, something that he should boast about, and he did boast about it in his letters, and I think that's probably what is most repugnant. What's different about that and Wexford is that Cromwell at Drogheda was completely in control. But a month later, he absolutely lost control of his soldiers. When they stormed into Wexford, it was very different. They weren't undertaking a vicious, hard and nasty siege. Negotiations were actually taking place at the point at which the soldiers were able to burst into Wexford. And Cromwell's letters back to England after that, after Wexford, are quite different to the Drogheda ones. They are almost surrendering to the will of God. I didn't want this to happen, we didn't want this to happen, but God clearly did. And in order to back that up, he starts drawing some very dubious lessons from the previous 10 years of history of Ireland. So what we have are two very horrible, nasty, violent, and reprehensible actions at Drogheda and Wexford. But context. Sieges in Ireland generally during the Civil War were more bloody, more violent, and often ended with a massacre of the garrison or part of the garrison. Cromwell's not alone in that. Some of the people who end up on the winning side, if we think of the Royalists as coming back in 1660 as winners, not as the best possible option out of a collection of rubbish options. Some of the people who managed to ingratiate themselves with the regime had very dark records of their behaviour in Ireland. And so Cromwell takes the blame for a lot of their activity. He takes, indeed, the resettlement, shall we say, transportation, probably more likely, of Irish people from the eastern side of Ireland across to the west is known as the Cromwellian settlement. Recent work has shown that Cromwell was actually sacked by the Commonwealth government from his position in Ireland because he objected to the nature of the Cromwellian settlement. He thought it was too harsh, probably also unmanageable and inefficient. So because he is dead, because his side has lost, he takes a lot of the blame. Now, this, of course, will come back when we talk about his religion. His attitude in Ireland was that of any general who is concerned about the continuing supply of his army. His army is instructed not to rob ordinary people, not to cause violence to ordinary Irish people, in spite of the religious difference. But as I say, that is then swamped by Drogheda and then Wexford, and then some of the rest of the Irish campaign where similar massacres are carried out by him or with his approval, tend to blacken his record extensively. And it's true that war in Ireland remains exceptional. I think probably one of the most important lessons from Cromwell in Ireland is that he isn't actually infallible. And that appears in an essay in the forthcoming book. He's not actually very good at siege warfare. In fact, General O'Neill at Clonmel in May 1650 effectively runs rings round Cromwell and exposes his limitations.
I think that's a really thoughtful analysis of quite a difficult question. If I can kind of follow it up, do you think in what happened in Ireland, is it just the context of the long-running war and rebellion there that leads to the much harsher dealing with garrisons and sieges? Or do you detect in Cromwell's writings and words that his decisions around things like no quarter at Drogheda are influenced by religion at all, by the religious difference? Because I struggle to imagine that happening, for example, in a siege in England at the same time. So is it religion? Is it the context of Ireland?
It's both of those and more, I think. I think you're right about generally, in terms of the sieges in England, it's much less like Drogheda and Wexford. But the siege of Beijing House, which Cromwell wins, is Beijing House near Basingstoke, is a garrison owned by a Roman Catholic and defended by Roman Catholic soldiers and Roman Catholic officers, and that is much more violent than others. And there are occasions during the war when Irish soldiers or people suspected of being Irish, and they may not actually be Irish at all, are singled out for brutal treatment in an English siege. So we have to come back. You are right, the religious issue is important, as well as that long contest of an Irish rebellion. Cromwell tends to voice his anti-Irishness in Drogheda and Wexford, both in terms of context of rebellion. Because Drogheda, his history, understanding of what in Ireland is quite confused, because Drogheda had been a Protestant strong point for much of the war, and much of the garrison who were there in 1649 were Protestants, and so they were caught up in the massacres. So it's not necessarily religious. But in Cromwell's eyes, it's the subversion and rebellion, I think, that are most important in terms of the killing. But the Irish question for him is complicated. His knowledge of Irish history is quite limited. We only know that he read Walter Raleigh's History of the World, other than the Bible and presumably religious commentaries. But nevertheless, he hasn't read much about what Raleigh wrote about Ireland. His view of religion in Ireland is very warped. He tends to think that the Reformation of England, Wales and Scotland was replicated to a greater extent in Ireland than it actually was. So he's tending to see the Irish in 1640s as being people who have been subverted by outsider priests, agents of the Pope and so on, who otherwise would not have been so rebellious and religiously apostate as he seems to think they are. The religious issue is important and very complicated, as it is in Cromwell's mind. So we can talk about that in a bit. But yes, it's a rebellion. Its religious differences do play a part in Cromwell's attitude to the Irish, but also it's his desire to end rebellion. It's not just a war in Ireland that will end if he wins that war. He hopes that it will be the end of the war in Britain and Ireland.
Interesting in terms of his kind of deep aversion to these people who are in rebellion, and that rebellion must be put down to kind of secure his kind of the Republic, I suppose, and the English position. And whether, I don't know, whether you can unpick from that the kind of English view of Ireland as a domain that is to be ruled and is therefore kind of has no right to rebel. If I can push you for a kind of decisive answer on this, do you think Cromwell's actions in Ireland could or should be interpreted as a war crime? And was actions such as the settlement of thousands of New Model Army veterans on expropriated land in Ireland, is that ethnic cleansing, or is it not helpful to use those terms?
I don't think it's helpful to use either of the terms. However, you can see elements of both of those occurring. The settlement of Ireland was brutal, and it was undoubtedly an act of an imperial state. Ireland was seen as somewhere by the English and Welsh and Scots as somewhere that needed modernising. Particularly in the English mind, there was no question that English civilization was the height of civilization to which everybody should aspire. And that's taking the religious element out of it. And so they believed, erroneously, terribly and wrongly, whatever way you want to put it, that the Irish needed to have English civilization in which to reach a peak of existence. And that's without the religion. So therefore, the conquest of Ireland over the previous 4 centuries was seen as the natural modernization of a state. Everything that the Irish did was regarded as being less civilized, right from music to law to government to landholding and so on. And even the English even thought that possibly true of the Scots, and quite probably some of the Stuart monarchs would have agreed with them. I think James VI and I also tended to a great extent to see England as a modernizing nation. So all of that is in the background of it. So if we put the Cromwellian settlement into a greater context, then all colonial processes are in effect ethnic cleansing. And it had been going on for 400 years before Oliver Cromwell landed at Ring's End. In terms of war crimes, it would probably be judged that no, he wasn't a war criminal, because the context of the wars in which he fought allowed for what had happened at Drogheda in extremis. There were other equally bad, equally horrific and unforgivable massacres in Irish history perpetrated by both sides. Probably, I think colleagues of mine would argue that more by the English than others, but there's no doubt that all sides in Ireland, be it the Scots, be it the Irish, be it the English and Welsh, all participated in that sort of thing. And so probably no, under those terms, it wouldn't be a war crime. Different now, perhaps. But as the targets of the vengeance after Drogheda, if not always the victims of that anger, the targets were soldiers in arms. And the others were what we now euphemistically term collateral damage.
Right. Well, that's an interesting perspective, and it does shed a lot more both on Ireland and on his military career in a whole. I think adds a lot more to what we had to say about it, I'm sure. I now want to get towards things that we didn't cover in our own description of Cromwell's military career. And that's what Cromwell actually really is more well known for, probably, is Cromwell the politician, Cromwell the man who killed a king, Cromwell the man who turned England into a republic. So before the regicide, before the execution of Charles I, let's kind of go to kind of 1646-47. What do we know about Cromwell's political beliefs, and how influential a political player was he? Okay.
To start with 1646 and 47, I think we briefly need to cover his political experience beforehand. He isn't in any way a major politician. He's not a major figure. He's a useful assistant for most of his career. He only makes one intervention, of which we only have garbled references, in his first parliamentary appearance, which is in the late 1620s. He's there because he's there. He's there because he's a Cromwell. He's there because his family have been in Parliament before. It's not his own natural merits. And in fact, in local government, he makes a complete disaster of his local government political career in the 1630s. When he serves in Parliament in the beginning of the 1640s, before the war, he's remarked on, rather for his scruffiness than his ability. He's very useful at being a committee member and the chair of a committee. He gets some important roles, but all of those things are given to him by members of his family and their political allies who are more powerful and more influential than he is. he's a useful man. That useful manness becomes the reason he's appointed captain. In fact, we could argue he's not politically perceptive. He thought the grand remonstrance would pass through Parliament without problem, not that the discussions would go on till well after midnight and it would only scrape through a vote. He wasn't hugely a good, strong political player. The war changes all of that, and it changes it all by making him more radical as well as more influential. A lot of his influence in politics from 1646 becomes, again, because he's a very useful commander. Remember, at that point, he hasn't yet, apart from small offshoot campaigns, he hasn't yet commanded an entire army. He is still a second in command, a very good, very useful, well-connected second in command. What happens in 46 and 47, he becomes to some extent radicalized. But I think it's a temporary radicalization. He realizes that the men he's cared for very much over the intervening years are not being treated well by Parliament. Parliament wants the war to be over. It wants a quick peace with the king. It wants to send the soldiers home. And its entire policy is geared to that. And it wants to send the soldiers home as fast as it can and as cheaply as possible. So some of the regiments are 40 weeks in arrears of pay by this point. And some of the soldiers are naturally worried that when they go home, without there having been a massive political resettlement, there will be royalist vengeance upon them through the courts for things they've done during the war. And there are also no guaranteed pensions. There is a pension scheme in England at this time where maimed soldiers, people who have been injured and can't work, and even some widows, may receive a pension at the behest of the local JPs. And that's going to be the problem after the war, because probably the majority of JPs who will be returning to work as JP, Justice of the Peace, in 1646 would be royalists or royalist sympathisers. And they know, the soldiers know, that they'd be unlikely to get a pension out of them because it's an arbitrary system. It's not an automatic system. So the soldiers have another grievance. They want their money, they want political protection, and they want financial protection for their wounded colleagues and the widows and orphans left by the war. And Cromwell agrees with that, largely speaking. He sees that all of those things are fair. But you can't just do that without drifting. I mean, our modern world, we'd say drifting leftwards, probably. But drifting into uncharted territory for a man like Cromwell, a man who still firmly believes that political power is related to the possession of property, and that if you don't own property, you are not responsible enough to have a vote or a political office. But he does see that these men who have fought, and often those who have died for the parliamentarian cause, have themselves a just cause in 46 and 47 when Parliament's trying to disband them. And Parliament has quite explicitly and probably naively involved the parliamentarian soldiers in the politics by producing booklets, one called the Soldier's Pocket Bible and one the Soldier's Catechism, which actually are effectively instruction manuals explaining to ordinary soldiers their political role in a better Britain or a better England or in better England and Wales. And they're actually intimately involved in the cause. So these soldiers themselves who want these demands see them as part of something bigger, as part of a demand for a resettled, a recreated, a reborn England and Wales. And so that is latched onto by more politically astute people who are collectively known as the Levellers, who want real political change. They just don't want the king brought back and his powers limited. They want real political change. They want probably the end of a monarchy, the establishment of the supremacy of Parliament, the end of aristocratic power. They and the soldiers have connected, but not exactly identical political aims. Now, Cromwell will go part of the way towards that. go with the soldiers' demands. But what he doesn't yet want is something far more radical. The Levellers draft a prototype constitution, the Agreement of the People, which suggests redistribution of parliamentary seats, effectively manhood suffrage, though there's also women's sections within the Levellers who want to expand manhood suffrage to universal suffrage. But Cromwell's not prepared to go that far. He wants all of these things that he probably regards as fairness to be sorted out before you take on the bigger political issues. Now, if Cromwell had a reset button, like a computer or a mobile phone, you press that button, he would return to being a monarchist. I think probably for most of his life, Cromwell is a monarchist. He believes that the natural state of government is a monarchy. His family have made their money out of the monarchy. The Cromwells exist because of the monarchy. And it's hard to shift him from that position. I'll come back to refusing the crown if you want me to at another point. So what you've got is a man who is essentially a monarchist, wants a reformed monarchy that is more fair to the just demands of a populace. But the populace aren't necessarily to be involved in political decision making.
What I think is interesting about that perspective is that essentially you could sum up the majority of parliamentarians' view as being what you've just described, essentially not opposed to the monarchy per se, but just wanting some sort of more responsible kingship and limitations that make them more accountable to the voice of Parliament.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think that's what they were aiming for in 1641, and most of them still wanted in 1646 as the first war in England and Wales came to an end. If you add in the British element of that, the Scots would want the king to accept a Presbyterian church system, the same as you have in Scotland. So essentially it is what Robert Ashton called many years ago conservative revolution. The problem for those men is that everything has moved on much further. The functional radicalism that Gerald Aylmer said that happened, that in order to establish an alternative government, you have to, even if it's temporary during the war, you have to go beyond the limitations of the constitution you've already got. And you have to create things that, in a sense, will never go away. And I think some of those politicians thought that some of the things, the radical moves that they'd undertaken from 1641 onwards, would eventually be removed and you would go back to something far more recognizable. The problem is you've got a galvanized army that has what could be termed as personal and social and economic complaints, but we all know those are grouped under politics. And you've got a king who simply won't accept that he's been beaten and therefore is keeping England in a state of anarchy almost. And so, yes, that majority of parliamentarians, and adding the Scots as conservative politicians as well, they, unfortunately for them, the times they were a-changing, and they were going to have to catch up.
So how does Cromwell go from being, as you described, in a kind of monarchist, almost conservative, to almost being the leader of a radical position that ends up advocating executing the king and founding a republic?
When Cromwell came across the Levellers, particularly at a major meeting at Putney Church in October 1647, it was quite clear there that his boundaries were drawn at the notion of ordinary people being involved in choosing governments. He was still convinced, as I said earlier, that property conveyed power, and that if you hadn't got property and were making laws that dealt with property, it would be almost anarchy, if you like. But also those decisions wouldn't be mature. What happened after that is partly the problem of Charles I not accepting that he'd been defeated. In 1648, you got a second civil war, which began from popular risings associated with unhappiness over certain decisions that the parliamentarian government had undertaken in 1646, 47, 48, including the abolition of Christmas as a public holiday. From that grew a more sustained rebellion as royalist leaders who were still in the country began to manipulate these risings in their own interest. So you got risings in South Wales, you got risings in Yorkshire, you got risings in Kent and Essex and North Wales as well. Alongside that, the Scots had parted company from their English parliamentarian allies over their lack of confidence in the English imposing or adopting a Presbyterian church structure. And they had drifted, or at least a significant group at the end of 1647, had drifted towards the King's cause and were in 1648 raising an army to invade England. This is one of the things that persuades Cromwell that the anarchy of having a monarch who didn't believe he was defeated was a problem that had to be dealt with. The Second Civil War was over relatively quickly. All right, you got some places in Yorkshire hanging out a bit longer, but the Scots were defeated at Preston. The Royalists in Kent and Essex were trapped eventually in Colchester and forced to surrender, and Cromwell himself defeated the rebels in South Wales as well. So it was over quite quickly, but it was quite clear that there was now a very great division in Parliament itself. There were some who wanted to very, very quickly end all of this anarchy by making peace with the king, and there were those who were growing to realise that the king was the problem, not a symptom of problems of dysfunctional government. And it was the latter group that managed to force its decisions on Parliament largely by blocking the doors and keeping the more conservative MPs out of Parliament on the 7th of December 1648. Now, Cromwell wasn't actually personally involved, and evidence of his involvement has largely disappeared. Nevertheless, the day after Parliament has been purged of these conservative figures, Cromwell turns up in Parliament and is quickly assimilated into this more radical group, which is led intellectually by his son-in-law, Henry Ireton. Now, Ireton and the army are able to force this shrunken Parliament into devising a trial, and that King Charles I will be brought to court and charged with treason, which happens in January 1649. Cromwell is involved in that, but the extent to which he is a leading figure is not clear. Certainly, after the Restoration, a lot of people who'd signed the King's death warrant or participated in some other way with the execution of the King tended to make Cromwell very centred, the very centre of this rebellion. But there were others as well, and Cromwell is probably still quite reluctant to take the step towards executing the king. And executing the king takes place at the end of January. He's found guilty in a court by a series of commissioners and is executed on the end of January 1649. Only then do they begin really discussing what government will look like. And over the next 3 or 4 months, they decide they don't need a House of Lords, that you only have a House of Commons, that there will be an executive government called executive body in government called the Council of State, and that England, Wales, and Ireland will divest itself of the monarchy and become a republican free state. Ireland is bound up in this because by the 17th century, it is seen as part of the powers of the English monarch to be King of Ireland, and so Ireland is regarded very much like Wales as part of England or part of England's governance by this point. Scotland is an independent nation, The only links between Scotland were monarchical through James VI of Scotland inheriting all the other thrones in 1603. So Scotland is to be left out of it. Cromwell becomes the first president of the Council of State, but he's still very much a servant of the state. He's not the commander-in-chief of the army. That's still Thomas Lord Fairfax. And it is this Council of State and Parliament that sends Cromwell over to Ireland and the campaign that we discussed earlier. But Cromwell, his exact attitudes to the monarchy and the end of the monarchy are still quite hard to define. It's later, in the 1650s, when he's been offered the crown himself, that he makes his position more clear, that the monarchy had to go because God had decided that way, in that God had given victory to the parliamentarians, not just in the First Civil War, but in the Second Civil War, and given them the power to take over the state and execute the king. So we only know later on that Cromwell has decided that not just was Charles I a bad monarch, but the concept of the monarchy is flawed and doesn't work. It's a long and slow journey for him. And possibly, it is possible, I would argue, it's never fully resolved in him until before he dies.
Yeah, this is one of the most difficult parts, I think, of Cromwell to understand.
Yeah.
Is that we're at this point where, as you say, he's kind of, well, it's not clear how much in favour he is of killing the king, and yet killing the king is intimately associated with him. And he becomes president of the Council of State, the new kind of executive power, and England and Wales and Ireland are governed by this Commonwealth, this Republic of the Council of State and this purged rump parliament. What kind of idea do we have of, did they think this was a new long-term political system? Did Cromwell buy into that? Did he think this was the kind of the way England should be governed?
Yes, I think he did, certainly initially. I think he accepts that at least for the time being, you've got a republican system. He does discuss the state of the monarchy with several people in the next few years, and you can still see that he still has this touch of monarchy. It's not surprising. It's a very radical and exciting and dangerous thing to have done, to execute a king, overthrow the system of monarchy and aristocracy and introduce a republican system. And I think he's still getting used to it. So whether he sees it as temporary or not is not quite so clear. But there are a lot of people, like Arthur Hazelrig that I mentioned earlier, who do see it as the system that is in place and will be steadily and slowly improved. So there are a lot of people who see the revolution is over with the creation of the Commonwealth. But for Cromwell and others, particularly other members of the army command, Parliament does not solve anything. It doesn't go any more radically beyond what had been achieved by 1646-7, except for the creation of the Republic itself. The laws are still practiced in Latin. The laws are still okay if you can afford it. There isn't a reward system for the army. It's still seen as a burden, not a major contributor to the success of Parliament in some ways. And the divisions that existed in 1646 and 7 between Parliament and the army haven't really gone away. And Cromwell ties that to a lack of progress. He said, it's him that claims that the Battle of Worcester is a crowning mercy. And what he means by that is, that's it, we're done. God has chosen who is the winners. It is now time to radically change things in the law and in social structure potentially, but also in religion. And he then becomes, from 1651 to 53, steadily disenchanted with the progress of parliamentarian government. It isn't achieving what he thinks it could have done. The society hasn't changed much. Apart from it being a republic. There aren't greater freedoms. Religion is still a contentious issue and has not been finally settled. And Parliament still doesn't want to pay the army. So in a sense, nothing has changed.
So
now,
if
whether that makes radical
Sorry.
or just more determined to put an end to the uncertainty is debatable.
Yeah, I was going to come on to this. So if the idea that the Commonwealth, at least as Cromwell and the army sees it, is just the status quo, they've changed they've got rid of the figurehead, but they've not really brought about any real change. Why is it then that at this point, I guess what I'm getting at is what societal change do we know did Cromwell actually want to happen? Why was he disappointed with what the Commonwealth was doing, especially given, I presume, he supported really the dismembering of the leveller movement that we've described. Their leader, John Lilburn, ends up basically arrested and being spirited away. So if he wasn't in favour of the leveller position, what social change did he want to see that the Commonwealth wasn't delivering?
I think he still largely wants to see that fairness that I think was what motivated him to support the ordinary soldiers in 1646 to 7, that there would be safety nets for those people who'd actually won the war, and that wasn't done. He also wanted to see the breakdown of a state church, and I think he was very much worried that there was still a potential for the creation of an exclusive Presbyterian church system, certainly not one at that point that recognised individuals' right to choose the way they worshipped was important to him. He also wanted a political system that was a little more balanced, but not radically so, but one which would ensure that the Republic would survive. And what he becomes worried about by 1653 is that Parliament is drifting back to the way it was in late 1648 and is going to introduce a new series of elections that won't have sufficient safeguards for the soldiers, the widows and orphans and the victors of the war, and might well allow for the election of a strong royalist party in Parliament. And those things are what particularly concern him. And it focuses down in the end, in spring 1653, to the nature of the forthcoming elections. And he believes, after long discussions, that he's got his way and there will be safeguards introduced into this. And so on the day of April the 19th, he goes to bed thinking that it's all going to be solved, and that in Parliament we'll discuss a more appropriate form of elections the following day. When he gets up and has an early morning meeting with the officers, he finds out the exact opposite has happened, and that Parliament is still in effect discussing the old legislation for new elections, which would not have those safeguards in. Now, it might be, and this is one of the great mysteries of history, it might be that it's a misunderstanding. And that when he storms off angrily into Westminster and expels all the MPs from Parliament on April the 20th, it's a misunderstanding. We know that when he storms in there, has the bauble taken away, the soldiers manhandle the MPs and throw them out, that he picks up the paper of the legislation that was being discussed. Now, obviously, the easy answer to our historical problem would be if that piece of paper existed, and it would show what actually we're discussing that morning, but it doesn't. We don't know what they were discussing. There's no evidence that Cromwell was right, that he thought they were discussing the wrong bill. Nevertheless, he's now the most authoritative figure in the country. He tries not to be. They tried to set up what we would probably call a constitutional assembly, intentionally to be short-lived parliament called the Little Parliament. It's much smaller than a normal House of Commons, which goes down in history as bare-bones Parliament after the leading figure, a London merchant who's one of the principal actors in that Parliament. The intention is that this sets up a new constitution. The problem is it doesn't. It just starts sitting as a Parliament. It almost is a hanger-on of the parliament that had existed before, even though it's a nominated assembly with hand-picked individuals in it. It still doesn't go anywhere. In the end, it implodes in December 1653, and all the powers are handed to Cromwell. And Cromwell at that point, in December 1653, becomes the Lord Protector, which again, in its sense, is a temporary title. It's from the monarchy. It was last used during the reign of Edward VI, and is seen very much as a person who's in charge while the king is ill or a minor or possibly even abroad at war. So in the sense of the monarchical element, we haven't progressed very much by December 1653. It's what happens after that that's more exciting, I think.
Well, yeah, let's get on to that. So what we effectively have in the protectorate under Lord Protector Cromwell, I might describe as a kind of series of constitutional experiments, if that would be fair. Now, the question that I think is quite contentious is, are these experiments in democratic or progressive government with big inverted commas, or is this, as Winston Churchill once described, military dictatorship? Because it's the army has put Cromwell there. It's the army that's put together the instrument of government, the written constitution that Cromwell was to rule with. So, yeah, what is this? If it can't be both, can it?
Possibly more an enlightened dictatorship, but I think what I would argue is that it is a progressive government. It's an experiment. It's a system of experiments. And we have to remember that it's always portrayed as a failure, because as soon as Cromwell dies, it starts to fall apart. But the problem is it's a very short-lived government, and it's never allowed to fully develop, partly because of Cromwell's longevity. If we think about it, the entire existence of Cromwell's protectorate is about the length of a modern parliamentary session. And if we think of, for instance, perhaps the most, I use the term in inverted commas, radical element of democratic government we've had in recent years, Margaret Thatcher's government, which changed a lot of the precepts, they achieved very little in the first 5 years. And they were in a system that already existed. What you've got with Cromwell is a system that's being started almost right from fresh in December 1653 and is over before December 1658, largely speaking. So you get these experiments. You get the creation of a Council of State, a single person in charge, which looks very like what was being demanded in 1641 and therefore can be neatly tucked into that conservative parliamentarian perspective. So we can see that. But you still initially maintain a unicameral assembly, a one-chamber parliament. But that, again, is an experiment, and within a few years they get the creation of an upper house or second house, because Cromwell realises that an unfettered single chamber can act like a corporate dictatorship. And it needs a balance and check that can't be provided necessarily simply by the single person or the Council of State. So you get this series of experiments all within a very short space of time. And possibly, by September 1658, had Cromwell not died, you might have got a settled state of government. What we had decided in that period was there was not going to be a monarchy. Cromwell was offered the crown at the beginning of 1657, and it's often thought that he turns it down because of the pressure of the army. And I don't think that's true. I think Cromwell himself has decided that God has blasted the title of the monarchy, and that he doesn't want to be a monarch. He says he's quite happy as Lord Protector. A crown is a feather in the cap. He's a constable to protect the parish, which is a very interesting role to choose, which is a podcast in itself, probably, choosing that title, because he's not referring to a constable like you had traditionally in England, like they thought the Earl of Essex could become in 1642, or one that you have in France. He is thinking very much of a parish constable. So there are a lot of radical things, and the most radical thing, I think, is that we have decided that a monarchy is not a fit form of government. Now, as to the dictatorship, a lot of the notions of dictatorship rest on a failed experiment. That is, that the country is divided up into regions, each of which has a major general in charge of it. Now, that's a problem because it makes it look like a military dictatorship, and in that it's a failure. What you've got are a series of people who are given powers of oversight. The problem we have with English government in the 17th century, regardless of the Civil War, is that it is not the same everywhere. Government in the counties is still very much county focused, and the responsibility of the county governors, who are of course the rich men and women sometimes in the county who have authority in government of that county. And it means that nothing is exactly the same in each county. The purpose of having 12 major generals, each with a group of counties under them, is to try and level that playing field. It doesn't work. It's resented. The use of military titles is inappropriate then as it is now. But you can see what the idea was. The problem was nobody actually liked it, and even Cromwell lost interest in it. But some of these major generals worked really hard. The thing they were not was actually military leaders. They were far more involved in the legal, social, economic, and administrative functions of the counties. Because their title was inappropriate, they put everybody's backs up, and they actually worked against Cromwell's greater target, greater aim, to bring people back together after over a dozen years of war. And they were counterproductive. But it doesn't mean that they were part of a military dictatorship. Cromwell is surrounded by people who are not soldiers. Even the instrument of government, though it's written by General John Lambert, is influenced by others. You can see even leveler politics in the instruments of government, particularly with the sort of representation in Parliament and so on. So it is a series of radical steps, and it might have been settled during 58, 59 had not Cromwell died. And Cromwell's death just opens up all the divisions again between Parliament and the army, and the Republicans who thought that the Commonwealth was the finished system and you didn't need a protectorate. Cromwell's death is responsible for the fall of the Republic as much, if not more, than anything else. Which is a problem in itself. You have a republic existence entirely dependent on the one man who can do the balancing act.
True. Do you think then Cromwell as a politician, he's I mean, it's come through, I think, in this discussion. He's hard to pin down, isn't he? Do you think he had strong political beliefs, or was he simply pragmatic and looking for the best solution?
I think he's pragmatic. He talks a lot. People say he's quite boring at times, but I think what he's doing, he's eliciting other people's ideas at every opportunity. And I think he's deliberately provoking people into responding so they can take on some of their ideas. He is a pragmatist. I don't think he's ever really a brilliant politician. He matures, certainly, in 1649, 50, 51 to 53. You can see the development of statesmanship, which has never been something that he's had to think about before. And I think, therefore, that he is getting better as a politician. But it is the problem for the Republic is that it's the force of his personality. He is the man who's got a foot in both camps. He's a soldier, he's a politician. He's been a local administrator. He's been a JP. He's been an MP. He's done all of those things, and he's in this unique position. He is the man who ended the war, after all, which is a problem because he only has 5 years. I don't think anybody could have done something better in 5 years unless you were a Napoleon. And even he had fantastic advisors at the beginning of his reign. before the period when he's surrounded by sycophants. So I think it's an almost impossible job, but I think he almost gets there.
One of the things I think is interesting about his political career is at the decisive moments, he always seems to be on the periphery, despite him being the central figure. So the purge of Parliament in 1648, he's not even there. He's not in London, I don't think. Yeah, his appointment as Lord Protector is done by the army, and again, he's on the periphery. The execution of the king, like we say, we're not 100% on his specific role. Do you think is he keeping his fingerprints off it in a Machiavellian kind of way? Or is he just do you think he's just so... There's a picture of Cromwell as a kind of power-hungry schemer, which that would fit into the idea that he gets other people to do the dirty work and picks up the pieces. Or there's an idea that he's simply just a really reluctant leader who has to have power pushed onto him. What do you think?
I think you were right earlier when you said he was a pragmatist. He always plays the reluctant leader, as everything thrust upon him, but I don't really believe that. I think that is a position that he is choosing to represent himself in. I think he believes that he is doing God's work, not because he's arrogant, but because he's winning everything. Or at least if he doesn't, he can get away with looking as if he's won everything. And I think that, again, coming back, he's a pragmatist. He's not the most original thinker. He takes ideas from everywhere. It's not just the army that put him in the position of Lord Protector. There are civilian politicians who are putting him there as well. And I think it's a combination of that. He's not confident enough to go out for it, but once he believes that what he is doing is God's will, that gives him that backbone, that confidence that he would otherwise lack.
Let me get to another kind of charge that some people, Cromwell's detractors, might lay at his door. And that would be one of hypocrisy. There's kind of some remarkable parallels, if you like, in terms of Charles kind of ignites the Civil War by trying to bringing soldiers into the House of Parliament, trying to arrest MPs. And of course, Cromwell, I think more than one occasion, the army basically comes into Parliament and gets rid of who they don't like. Cromwell and Charles both kind of believe that their right to rule, in very loose sense, comes from God, that somehow God is responsible for putting them where they are. And of course, both of them are very not keen on the more radical ideas that come out of the English Revolution and Civil Wars. You know, they both lock up, let's say, John Lilburn. So do you think there's anything in that they are almost two sides of the same coin?
I think the situations they find themselves in give it that impression. I don't think Charles's belief in God's divine right of kings, he's a lazy man, and it provides him with an excuse. His father is not a lazy man, and he understands that if you are there because of the divine right of kings, you have to really work at it. The difference between that and Cromwell is that Cromwell seeks evidence from God that he is the chosen person at any point. He locks up Lilburn because Lilburn is a problem. He is stirring up rebellion in the army whenever he can. He also has created this radical image of radical politics that probably Cromwell feels the country is not ready for at that point. But remember, he adopts, within the instruments of government, he adopts some of their policies. I think Cromwell is learning his trade as a statesman. That he repeats some of the mistakes of Charles I, though we have to actually remember Charles I doesn't actually succeed in clearing Parliament out. Cromwell does. Charles's ideas of going into Parliament and arresting 5 members are quite half-baked. Cromwell's decisiveness on the 20th of April is not half-baked in terms of the action, even if it's grounded in a mistake or a mishearing, as it might be. No, I don't think they're two sides of the same coin, but they do face some similar situations. Cromwell is far more, in a sense, humble in his position as a leader, because he sees that God hasn't automatically given him this role. He has had to deserve it, and he has to keep justifying that appointment, if you like.
Well, that brings us neatly on to, I think, the final aspect of Cromwell we want to discuss, which is Cromwell as a religious man. And it's been, this whole, I think, discussion has been saturated with it. It's kind of the elephant in the room. In every aspect of what Cromwell has done, religion is at the root of it, at least how he sees it. So what exactly was Cromwell's what exactly were his religious beliefs?
Right. This is the only thing that Cromwell gives us very little information about directly. We know that Cromwell was born and registered in the Anglican Church, or the Church of England as it was. His children are all baptised in the Church of England according to the rites of the Church of England. But we know that he sees something deeper in the relationship between individuals and God that is not covered by a state church, whether it's Presbyterian, as in Scotland, or the Church of England, as in England. And Wales. He sees that that the relationship between God and individual is very personal, and that it shouldn't be superseded by structures and systems that tell you how to manage that relationship with God. We're not even sure when he undergoes this being born again. There are possibilities it's in late 1620s, which is his late 20s as well, or it's in the 1630s. Certainly we have evidence of it by the latter part of the 1630s, that he's undergone some form of religious experience. That side of it doesn't necessarily change. What he does after that is associate with the people who think like he does. But one of the charges of hypocrisy is that he doesn't actually believe in religious freedom except his own form of religious freedom. And I don't think that's a sustainable argument. I think Cromwell very much thinks that your position regarding God is so intensely personal that it shouldn't be interfered with. But that doesn't mean either that you should look down on, disparage, or ban other people who have a different perspective of their relationship with God, but that you associate with those who agree with you. He's referred to as independent, as in he's a man who believes that churches shouldn't be part of an overall structure. Alternatively, he's known as a Congregationalist, and the Congregationalism means effectively that you are amongst a band of brothers and sisters who worship God in your own way, or understand the relationship between God in your own way, and only if that congregation finds another like-minded congregation should there be any wider association of individual churches. That's as far as it goes. But even then, you find Cromwell being curious. The only thing we know he doesn't like, apart from Catholicism, which he sees as erring, is the other thing he doesn't like is any form of Unitarianism. He accepts God as being in 3 persons. He doesn't think of God as a single being. But even then, when he comes across a Unitarian who is being persecuted by Parliament, he stands up for his rights, even though he doesn't actually agree with them at all. He doesn't really agree with Quakerism. He doesn't like them. He finds them a nuisance. They have that terrible anarchistic tendency of running naked into church services, which is totally against his sort of belief in order and structure. Yet he befriends George Fox and talks to him on several occasions and has a very intense and personal relationship with him. I think Cromwell's religion has to be understood in the way Cromwell describes it, that he believes we all need to have our own relationship with God. And that means that he would accept Presbyterians with a Presbyterian church structure if it only related to the congregations who were part of it and wasn't overwhelming or overweening. It was just a church amongst other churches. So and you can see, he's been called a providentialist, that he sees the actions of God in things that are around him and makes his decisions based on that. And I think that he thinks that other people should do that as well. And that means that you could theoretically have Anglicans of the old church system. You could have not Catholics, that's the one that you'd rule out, and probably Unitarians, but you could have Quakers and Presbyterians and all the other groups, as long as they didn't oppress one another. And all the way through the 40s, when he's talking about the victories and the battles over the Royalists, he stresses that these people all are God-fearing, but their relationship with God is all different, and it doesn't matter what that is, they are all part of the winning side. So he's intensely personal, he's a providentialist, and he isn't a religious imperialist. He's someone, I think, who believes intensely that you find your own way with God and you live and commune with people who agree with you or are like-minded.
His religious beliefs seem almost modern, if we can put it in that way, in that the one policy that he strongly believes in for religion is freedom of conscience, isn't it? That you've kind of set out, or freedom of worship. And yet, of course, it's also, but not Catholic. So
at the moment,
there's a limit. Yeah.
He didn't live long enough. I mean, he knew Catholics. I mean, Catholic, there's two types of Catholic, I think, in Cromwell's mind. There's the Catholic who you meet socially and may do business with, pre-war. And then there's the evil Catholic empire that's trying to overthrow the state as you know it. And I think there are several versions of that in our contemporary world, where you may know people who you intensely disagree with on a personal level, but behind them is an evil empire trying to undermine everything you believe in. And you're right, it is almost modern, and I think it's certainly a major step to modernism, because the Restoration doesn't restore everything. It does create a single state church again, but it never eradicates the religious groups that have sprung up during the war. They continue to exist, and by the 18th and 19th century, these are becoming acceptable as mainstream churches. In fact, the modern world is populated with small churches, quite often with strange names, that Cromwell would quite happily recognise, I think. So yes, in that he's a modernist. He's taking steps towards the modern relationship between the secular and the religious.
And to kind of bring it all in the round then, I know, there has been many biographies of Cromwell, and I think all biographers of him, to a greater or lesser extent, acknowledge the difficulty in pinning down the man, which is kind of where we've got the inspiration for the title of this episode. I know that in a biography by Ian Gentles, you reviewed that and said that you strongly disagreed with the idea that all of Cromwell's achievements were effectively destructive. He destroyed the monarchy, he destroyed the old way, the state church, the parliamentary system that had existed. What would be your kind of counter argument to that interpretation? What did Cromwell build, and did any of it survive his death?
I think I took on the notion that everything Cromwell did was destructive, because whenever anything was destructive, such as those things you mentioned, The aim was to create something better. And he wasn't alone in that. He didn't end the monarchy himself. The ending of the monarchy, the creation of the republic, was a corporate effort. The continued development of Parliament was an effort towards that. I think he was genuinely attempting to reform the moral behaviour of the nation with the major generals, even though it was intensely flawed and ultimately failed. I think what Cromwell has done, the thing we've got with Cromwell is he's still ahead of us all. We haven't caught up with Cromwell yet. We're still struggling towards a political system that is radicalised, that was questioned in his day. Whenever we discuss the reformation of the House of Lords, we forget we've already done all of that. We got rid of them. We brought them back in a different format, creating a sort of almost a Senate, which has been models for other nations. We haven't yet gone beyond the fact we've got a head of state who is a monarch. We've not had Cromwell and his son Richard are the only non-royal heads of state. We haven't caught up with Cromwell yet. We are still trailing in his wake. And part of the problem and the cause for that was the Restoration, which made it almost, that period, the interregnum gives it away. It's almost as if there is nothing, there is a void between the reign of Charles I and the reign of Charles II. Certainly nothing you can dip into to model the future. Yet, in the end, that's what we will end up doing. We will create a modern upper house. We will do that because we know that a single chamber doesn't work. Cromwell understood, proved that, and set it right. And we've still got to get there. All of the questions about governance that we have discussed, the answers, or at least prototype answers, are there in the 1650s, and Cromwell was heading that. Just think, in recent politics, without giving away my position on Brexit, that confusion in September, when the Prime Minister had assistants lie to the monarch in order to get Parliament prorogued. If we had caught up with Cromwell, that could not have happened, because it would have been a democratic decision taken by the Houses of Parliament with no executive action which could subvert that governance. That's Cromwell's contribution. He's given us a future to strive for.
Well, wow. I hadn't thought of a lot of those issues in that way. Certainly the idea, of course, that there's still a House of Lords and still a monarchy, and the idea that the radicalism of the 1650s still, 400 years later, Britain is currently lagging behind, is a fascinating thought. I want to end with this idea of him as history's most complicated man. I thought that in Christopher Hill's biography of Cromwell, I think it's called God's Englishman, he kind of, without wanting to sound disparaging, he kind of bottles it in the final page, where he kind of says that basically he's torn between a boisterous and confident man of the 1640s who led the country forward and an aging and disillusioned man in the 1650s. He's kind of caught between his radical and his conservative traits. And he basically, Christopher Hill, says that the issue of Cromwell will remain unresolved kind of forever thus, and kind of abdicates passing any kind of judgment. So I'm going to try and make you pass some judgment instead, as difficult and as slightly ahistorical as that is. How can this massively complicated and in many ways contradictory man be summarized? What did he believe in, and what did he achieve? And you know, which of those pictures, if you like, do you think it is more accurate that Christopher Hill kind of paints?
I think the problem is, as with any human being, we're talking about a multifaceted character. He is miserable. He's not happy when he dies, but I think a lot of that is personal. It's his intense relationships with his family that is we don't fully understand, brings about such a great depression in him that he seems mentally and physically incapable of struggling his way through an illness which even 10 years earlier, or even 5 years earlier, he would have managed to fight off, I think. As to his the struggle between conservative and radical, I don't see it as a struggle. I see him as a conservative who begins to realise through development as a politician that the ideas that he and his family have clung on to for 150 years don't work any longer. And I think that the step towards getting rid of the monarchy, the end of the monarchy, and refusing the crown is a mark of progression. I think that's his greatest moment when he says, no, it's a feather in the cap. I'm a constable to keep the peace. I think that shows a great determination and strength of character against people from the army and people from civilian life who are trying to make him adopt a conservative structure. I think he's moved on beyond that. And at that point, he's also eschewed the mistake of the major generals. And as I say, I still think his greatest contribution to our history is setting us the future, which we have to attain.
Well, Peter, I'm just interested for a second in getting your perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. Cromwell is so difficult to kind of pin down, and I think you're right, Martyn, in the sense he's a human being, he's multifaceted. No one is consistent through their whole life. As someone, Peter, who probably doesn't have the biases of the British education system that puts forward a certain view of Cromwell, and being an outsider looking in, what do you think of him at the end of all this?
It's hard for me personally to kind of say, because I don't. Well, first of all, we didn't get taught a lot about. Well, in fact, I don't think in our system we didn't get taught anything about the history of Britain, and so a lot of this is new to me. Because I'm learning as we're going along here, obviously, and so it's hard for me to give my perspective on it. But I do think that he did do a lot for the future of Britain, and I echo Martyn, your points, and I think that he did do a lot of good things to set up the modern Britain that we know, and I think that he should be remembered as someone who put these things in place, but also being aware of the things that may not make him popular, and recognizing them. But I do think that his impact on history is undeniable, and I think that he should probably be remembered as someone who did a lot of good things.
I think if I can, Martyn, tie this awkwardly into slightly tiresome modern topical debate about who should have a statue. I presume, based on everything you've said today, that you don't think that Cromwell, that there are some statues of Cromwell in Britain, not that many, but I presume you very much think they should stay where they are.
Yes, I do. I think they should stay where they are. The whole statues issue is a complicated and complex one, and I think each needs to be taken on its merits. And what I don't like about it is this notion that if you take down a statue, you're actually obscuring history and turning it into something from which you cannot learn the mistakes. I think a lot of the ire directed at Cromwell, though it's fairly muted, is based on the Irish element in his history. I think if we took down Cromwell because of that, I think every single monarch from Henry I onwards would also have to be removed from every plinth and we would learn nothing from it. Learn from our mistakes, because our mistakes wouldn't be public. And I think possibly rather than taking down statues, we put up counter statues in order to excite debate and investigation rather than eradication of a past, no matter how uncomfortable it is to all of us.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, Martin. I think each one is an individual case, isn't it? And on both sides of that debate, the reason I say it's a bit tiresome is because I think there's not been much history in that debate. It's kind of been quite black and white. And really, history is the story of human beings, and human beings are very much not one-dimensional or black and white. So on that note, I think you are right in that I think ultimately Cromwell not only is a figure that has to be remembered to understand England and Britain, but also very much should be, and that, what we've discussed in terms of the more negative sides of him absolutely should be brought to the fore, and in many ways only serves to make him an even more complicated character, with so many kind of controversies surrounding every aspect of his life. There's a debate. Well, all that remains really, I think, is to say thank you so much, Martin, for giving up so much time for us. Like I've been saying, I really have kind of been fascinated by the kind of issues around Cromwell, and we thank you so much for coming on and giving us so much of your time.
It's been my pleasure to contribute to this.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure our listeners will completely disagree with us both about Cromwell and about history's most complicated man, which is a very open topic, but we would be delighted to hear our listeners' contributions on that. So you can email us histories.most@gmail.com, tweet us at historiesmost. Peter.
From us here at History's Most, I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex, and thanks so much for listening to History's Most.